Okay, hi guys. Um, I wrote this sermon, I don't know what you want to call it, a few weeks ago. And I thought I'd film me reading it because I need to put it somewhere. I've been itching to say it somewhere. So, I'm going to film me reading it. And yeah, I think I don't know what I'm going to call it, but I think I'm going to call it Be Joyful Always. Because that's the theme, I guess. Okay, so the other day I'm on carts. It's where I go out with my bright high-vis vest on and push 6 or less carts. That's the safety rule, 6 or less. Anyways, carts is one of the places I do my best thinking. It's mostly quiet, I'm outside, usually the weather is nice, and it's my domain, if you will, for the hour or however long I'm out there. I have attention deficit disorder, which can be a hindrance or it can be a good thing. And while I'm on carts, it's usually a good thing. One thing about my ADD is that my brain has trouble shutting up. It's constantly moving and thinking and coming up with ideas. Yes, ideas. Well, some people, for example, pastors, they probably have Bible verses swimming in their head. Math teachers have math equations. Teachers of young children probably have kids' songs in their head. Me? I'm a writer. So, I have sentences, paragraphs, and sometimes if I'm really lucky, I can even have a whole chapter swimming around in my head. I have figured out baby names. I have figured out how someone's going to announce that new baby. I have figured out who works where and what position they have. For example, I've been working on book 4 in my series. I wanted my characters to have met as young adults at what would have been one of their first jobs. My character Ruth, who, yes, is obviously based on me, meets Andrew. And at that time, she was the bagger courtesy clerk while he was a brandy new fresh checker. Now, that's just the backstory. I want this story to be a few years after that. So, where do I want them to go? Do they advance or do they move to a different department? That's the struggle. I figured this all out. Now I just need to figure out what happens next. And I'm sure you're wondering what that is. Well, Andrew goes from being a checker to being a manager to then one more step, being an SOM front-end manager. An SOM is a service operations manager. They keep their front end running smooth and even write the schedule. I know they do a lot more, but those are just some of the things. As Andrew gets moved up, Ruth gets transferred to another store. They were married and couldn't work at the same store. Ruth had thought about becoming an SOM, but just being a manager in the front end was enough for her. While I think of things like that, I'm also trying to come up with chapter ideas. Recently, while desperately wanting to finish book 3, I thankfully come up with an idea for one of the 5 sermon chapters. If you were at the open mic at Scumsea last year, then you heard the first sermon chapter. I called it The Sermon on the Small Mount. My other 4 sermon chapters, I wanted to write them about the 4 Sundays of Advent. Love, joy, hope, and peace. 1 Thessalonians 5:16 says, Be joyful always. I had looked at Bible verses about joy, and that one spoke to me. I liked it. Be joyful always. What does that mean? Well, I had to look at who was writing the sermon. My character Ruth, her mother Martha, who is also sometimes known as Moose, is the pastor of the family. Walking around on carts, I pull out all the info my brain has stored on her. She's the one writing this, so what does it mean to her? Well, it means a lot, actually. She'd heard the phrase a lot from her father growing up. She used to try and ward away the bad feelings she might have. Don't let that person get me down. Be joyful always. When she married, she brought it to her husband, and they incorporated it into their life and tried to teach it to their children. They even taught it to Ruth, their adopted daughter. To be joyful, one must see the joy. In her sermon, Martha talks about seeing the joy. She saw joy that day in her granddaughter, Darlene. When Darlene was born in Guatemala, before being adopted by Ruth, she was tested for hearing loss. It turns out Darlene was born with 80% loss in her left ear and 60% loss in her right. This means she can only hear about 20% in her left ear and 40% in her right. When she was given up for adoption, Darlene got the chance of her life to come to San Diego and get pro bono cochlear implant surgery. These cochlear implants would now help her hopefully hear better, maybe not fully, but much better than she had been. Now, getting back to the joy. It was the afternoon, and Martha and her husband Myron Moose and Mr. Moose Come on, trash can. Truck. Hopefully we'll let it. I don't know where it is. Okay. There it is. Okay. Now, getting back to the joy. It was the afternoon, and Martha and her husband Myron Moose and Mr. Moose were babysitting. Myron had just shown his granddaughter how to snap, like this. Now you may be confused. Most people were taught how to snap this way. Well, I was taught to do it this way. I guess it stuck with me as it has always sounded louder to me, which must be some sort of fancy science thing. I'll give you a moment to test it out for yourself. See, you hold your thumb and your thumb and your pointer finger pads together, and then slide the middle finger off the pointer finger, like this. Anyways, after Myron teaches Darlene to snap, she comes running to her grandmother, who had been sitting in her office working on what was probably a sermon. Nana, Nana! What, Leanie? Martha beams. Leanie was Darlene's nickname. Papa just taught me how to snap, she smiles, showing her grandmother how she could snap. Wow, that's awesome. You were really good at it, too. Yeah, and look, I can even hear it. Darlene was so excited that she could not only snap, but she could hear the small noise the snap made if she held her hand up to her ear. It was definitely a sign that her cochlear implants were working, and also her joyful moment for the day. The joy in her granddaughter was radiating from her. The joy in her granddaughter that was radiating from her was way more joy than Martha could ever need for one day. It was now a memory she could hold on to, and when things got tough, and she had to tell herself to be joyful always, she could remember that day and that memory, and the joy from that day would also boost her up and give her what she needed to get through that moment. I personally feel like I see joy a lot. For example, the other day at work, I was bagging up a lady's order. Her son was sitting in the cart. He had a R2-D2 and C-3PO shirt on. I complimented to him how cool his shirt was. That started it. He must have been a huge Star Wars fan, because he then started talking about AT-ATs, or AT-ATs as I've also heard them. Those are the big dog-looking things. As we were talking about Star Wars, I told him about when I was a kid. My dad was stationed in Florida to teach a class while he was in the Navy. My mom and I flew there to see him, and we even got to go to Disney World. The trip, my mom forgot my autograph book one day back at the hotel and had Mickey sign a piece of the menu so that my mom could glue it in later. I can remember going on the Star Tours ride. I don't remember a whole lot, but I remember it having a large lobby queue area with a large C-3PO in the middle that moved and talked. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. That was my joy for the day, seeing the kid's face light up and his mouth move a mile a minute, because he was obviously enamored with Star Wars. It felt awesome to be able to connect with him. That's what I try and do. See what the kids are wearing, maybe a toy they have, or how cute their hair is. Anything I can find that I like and connect myself to them. That I can keep the conversation going and pass the time for the both of us. It was the joy in that moment that helped me through the rest of the day. See, that was the day that I got the call that Paula had passed away. For those that don't know, I joined the Bell program when I was in the 4th grade. I can still remember one of the first lessons I got, how to ring the bell, all the basics. Really, just to get me started so I could come and practice and play with the rest of the group. This was back in 1999, and I have been awarded once the longest continuous member. I joined when I could have and haven't left since. Having the bell choir practice once a week for all that time is all I've ever known, and it feels good. It feels joyful. Having my bell choir practice is just one way to help me to be joyful always. There may be a few times when I go, I'm just not digging it, but the majority of times I am happy. I am joyful. The people I have met during those years have made my life easier to be joyful always.